For this time, we have chosen the crisis in Ukraine as a matter for deliberation, considering the urgency of the situation there. And we've clearly read the news, we've seen the headlines, the political crisis that began in Ukraine late last year spiraled into the downfall of one government and led to the rise of a new government. This led ultimately to a referendum in the state of Crimea to join Russia. Today we'll explore the implications of these developments. We have distinguished speakers on the panel. On my left is Her Excellency, Ms. Ludmila. Next to her is Mr. Nagara, and on my far left is Dr. Chandra Muzaffar. So without further ado, we will start with Her Excellency, Ms. Ludmila. Each speaker is given 30 minutes. So, Your Excellency, you may begin.
And let me begin by saying that I was born in Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine. My father was born in Kharkiv, and my grandparents, who were Russians but spent their entire lives living in Ukraine, are buried in one of the cemeteries.
Не слышно?
Микрофон повыше.
So as I mentioned, I was born in Kiev, my father was born in Kharkiv, and my grandparents, who were ethnic Russians, but spent their entire lives living and working in Ukraine, are buried in one of the cemeteries in Kiev. I spent the first month of my life in a building overlooking Maidan, the central square where all the recent events took place. My grandparents owned an apartment there. And this building could be seen in all the news reports on Maidan and Ukraine. Why I'm telling you this? I'm telling you this to underline the very close ties that exist between Russians and Ukrainians, whom we consider and will always consider to be our brothers and sisters, no matter what kind of political situation exists in our neighboring country. And this sentiment, I'm sure, is shared by an overwhelming majority of Russian and Ukrainian people. Even here in this hall, the staff of the Embassy of Russian Federation who is present, many actually, the names are of Ukrainian origin. My deputy, Mr. Ovchirenko, director of our cultural center, Mr. Gurko, these family names are of Ukrainian origins. Though you're Russians, but Belarusian, but all these names are actually of Ukrainian origin. Since the beginning of the crisis in Ukraine, so many lies and distortions occurred in Western mass media that sometimes while reading or watching these reports on CNN or BBC, I had that feeling that they were talking about a totally different country or situation. That is why I'm very appreciative and thankful for this opportunity given to me by JUST and its leader, Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, to clarify Russia's position and view on what is happening in Ukraine and how to solve the crisis and what are the implications. So what did happen? A deep political crisis overtook Ukraine. It was rooted partly in the obvious discontent of Ukrainian people with the government, which proved to be inefficient and not attending to the needs of society. But it also was a crisis deepened by opportunistic actions of external forces, which intended to break age-old ties uniting Ukraine and Russia, throwing Kyiv into a dilemma: the European Union, the West, or Russia. And this policy was pursued with unprecedented obtrusiveness. They started to request the signature of the European Union Association Agreement from the Ukrainian authorities under the threat of sanctions. Ministers and other representatives of the European Union and the United States marched openly among anti-government demonstrators. They also made provocative appeals for anti-government actions from speakers' stands. Can you imagine that happening somewhere in Europe or the United States? We all know about the Wall Street protests. Can you imagine our minister, Mr. Lavrov, distributing cookies to the protesters in the Wall Street? How will the American authorities react to that? Maidan was turned into a military camp. Well-prepared and equipped units of militants attacked law enforcement forces and occupied administrative buildings. In one of them, the House of Trade Unions, the so-called command post of the Maidan was organized, and a headquarters of the US Embassy operated constantly on the 7th floor of this building. Incidentally, snipers shooting both on representatives of law enforcement agencies and on demonstrators, the purpose of which was to provoke a change of power by force, was organized from this building. At one point of time, it seemed that it would be possible to stop the crisis before passing the point of no return. As we all know, on the 21st of February this year, President Yanukovych and leaders of the main opposition parties signed an agreement envisaging the disarmament of militants, the freeing of occupied administrative buildings, the creation of a national unity government, the launch of the constitutional process, and the organization of presidential elections by the end of this year. However, such a scenario has not seemed sufficiently radical to some people. The atrocities have continued. President Yanukovych was forced to leave Kiev and then Ukraine under the threat of physical reprisal. Legitimate authorities ceased to exist in Kiev. Violence became a norm of political life. Parties making up the parliamentary majority which supported Yanukovych became the target in the Verkhovny Rada, or the Parliament of Ukraine. As a result of this, Rada was reshaped and the so-called government of champions rather than the national unity government appeared. Those who organized the coup, national radicals, having, and I quote, racist, anti-Semitic, and xenophobic views, I end the quote, as the European Parliament defined them last year, hating everything Russian, not hiding that they considered Ukrainian supporters of Nazi their ideological ancestors, called the tune there. Actually, the uncomfortable truth is that a sizable portion of Kiev's current government and the protesters who brought it to power are indeed fascists. Ukraine is home to Svoboda, arguably Europe's most influential far-right movement today. Party leader Alexei Navalny is on record complaining that his country is controlled by a Muscovite Jewish mafia, while his deputy derided the Ukrainian-born movie star Mila Kunis as a dirty Jewess. In Svoboda's eyes, black people are unfit to represent the nation at Eurovision, lest viewers come away thinking Ukraine is somewhere near Uganda. Svoboda began life in the mid-90s as the Social National Party, a name deliberately redolent of the National Social Party better known as Nazis, with its logo the fascist Volksangel. In year 2004, the party gave itself an unobjectionable new name, Svoboda means freedom, and panned the Nazi imagery, and in the subsequent decade has seen its star swiftly rise. Now Svoboda holds a large chunk of its nation ministries, nearly a quarter, including the defense portfolio. And Svoboda's fresh faces are scarcely different from the old. One of its freshman members of parliament is the founder of the Joseph Goebbels Political Research Center, Joseph Goebbels being one of the close allies of Hitler in Germany, in Nazi Germany, and has hailed the Holocaust as a bright period in human history. One of the first decisions of the new authorities was the cancellation of the official status of the Russian language, which was used by the overwhelming majority of Crimeans and the population of the eastern and southeastern regions of Ukraine, thus, in one moment, marginalizing 1/3 of Ukrainian citizens. Then, for good measure, Svoboda launched a push to repeal a law against excusing the crimes of fascism. Actually, this kind of law exists in all the European countries. So Europe should be very proud that this kind of political forces are eager proponents of Ukrainian joining the family of the European Union. Kiev started to appoint governors to the eastern and southeastern regions of the country, mostly populated by Russian-speaking people who were rejected by the populations. Direct threats to send the so-called trains of friendship or groups of militants who could continue the atrocities committed in Kiev and several western and central regions of Ukraine were addressed to Crimea. This was the critical mass which has led the Crimeans to the rescue decision about self-determination and unity with Russia. So, an armed coup d'etat took place in Ukraine, and as a result of it, legitimate forces which are attempting to rule the country took over the state power. National radical elements keep exerting strong influence on decisions taken in Kiev by means of terror intimidation. They are obviously ignoring Ukrainian regions, Russian-speaking populations, and ethnic minorities' concerns. Kiev has forgotten engagement achieved in February 21st, as well as the agreement on the settlement of crisis in Ukraine signed between President Yanukovych and the opposition in presence of ministers of foreign affairs of France, Germany, and Poland. This particular situation has pushed legitimate authorities of Crimea to take decision on separation from Kiev by conducting a referendum on the future of the peninsula. So there is a lot of discussions on whether this referendum is legitimate or not. The right to self-determination of peoples is established in Article 1 of the Charter of the United Nations. It has been repeatedly confirmed by decisions of the UN General Assembly, for example in the Declaration on Principles of International Law, 1970, Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and People, 1960. In case if people do not have the opportunity to acquire their own status and to defend rights in the framework of the country of habitation, such people has a right to self-determine by separation from the above-mentioned state and or to align to another state. The aforesaid Declaration of 1970 confirms the inviolability of territorial integrity of the states conducting themselves in compliance with the principle of the equal right and self-determination of peoples, and thus possessed of a government representing the whole people belonging to the territory without distinction as to race, creed, or color. It is also stressed in the Vienna Declaration of the UN World Conference on Human Rights that countries aspiring to defend their territorial integrity should have governments representing the whole people belonging to the territory without any distinctions. During the period of more than 20 years of being part of Ukraine, people of Crimea couldn't have exercised its right to self-determine in the framework of Ukraine because of the policy implemented by the central authorities. In January 1991, the Crimea region held a referendum which resulted in passing the law on re-establishing the Crimean Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. In September 1991, the Supreme Soviet passed a declaration on state sovereignty. In 1992, the Constitution of Crimea was passed. However, in 1995, the Constitution of Crimea was repealed by the decision of the Supreme Rada and the President of Ukraine without agreement of the people of Crimea. Thus, the Crimea status has been changed from independent state within the structure of Ukraine, according to the Constitution of 1992, to autonomous republic as a territorial entity of the Ukrainian state. After the illegitimate and forcible taking power in Kiev, the situation with the possibility to exercise the right to self-determination in the framework of the Ukrainian state has considerably worsened. Thus, groups of persons controlled by the Kiev authorities have made attempts to overthrow legitimate Crimean authorities and organize a criminal prosecution. The authorities in Kiev do not represent all Ukrainian people, especially the population of Crimea, and they do not even control significant part of the territory of their own country, where local autonomous bodies are taking power. Thus, the people of Crimea did not have any possibility to exercise right to self-determination in the framework of the Ukrainian state, and the Ukrainian state itself has lost the right to defend its territorial integrity. Qualification of the referendum as inapplicable to the Constitution of Ukraine means nothing to the matter of its legitimate status under the international law. The practice of exercising the right to self-determination by separation demonstrates that it cannot be realized in accordance with national legislatures for objective reasons. Interesting enough that the United States, in their memorandum presented to the International Court of Justice on the case of accordance of Kosovo separation to the international law, declared that, and I quote, declarations of independence can and inherently often do violate domestic law, but it does not mean that the violation of the international law took place, unquote. Besides the US, a number of states have defended the legality of Kosovo's action in the court. The International Court of Justice has declared that, I quote, general international law does not contain prohibition applicable to declarations of independence, unquote. Crimea has definitely more reasons to exercise the right to self-determination by separation than Kosovo. Kosovo was torn from Serbia by forcible action by several states without sanction by the UN Security Council, and declared its independence in the presence of legitimate and freely elected authorities in Serbia. There was no referendum on independence in the territory of Kosovo. Serbian population was prevented from expressing its opinion and declared its own independence from the region. There was no situation that represented a threat to the right to self-determination of Kosovo within Serbia in the period of declaring its independence. In any case, on the 21st of March, Crimea and Russia reunited as a result of the referendum in Crimea, during which the overwhelming majority of the population, 96%, voted to be with Russia. It can be argued that the referendum was legitimate or illegitimate, but we cannot ignore one simple truth. People of Crimea very clearly expressed their will and their desire to be part of Russia and their rejection of the authorities in Kiev. If it is not democracy, then what is? Of course, democracy can be defined in different ways now. The classical definition of democracy, deriving from the meaning of the word in ancient Greek, means demos, people, krasi, rule, the rule of people. But of course now democracy is much more defined as anything that the United States want. So what now? Now the very acute political crisis in Ukraine should be resolved. And it is of paramount importance for Russia to see our neighboring country as a stable and prosperous state. Without the help of the international community, it would hardly be possible. We are committed to discussions with our Western partners. The last contacts by Minister Lavrov with the US Secretary of State John Kerry and his contacts with Germany, France, and several other countries show that a feeling for a potential joint initiative which could be proposed to Ukraine is being outlined and considered. This is a very important update because until recently our partners in the West proposed to create a contact group under the supervision of which Russian and those who have now seized power in Kiev would work on an agreement. For us, this is an absolutely unacceptable format, and it is not about an agreement between Kiev and Moscow. It is about Ukrainians resolving the crisis in their own country. The fact that the current events in Ukraine are the result of a deep crisis of national identity caused in particular by the inability of the Ukrainian leadership to reconcile interests of Western and Southeastern regions. Things cannot keep going on in this way. We are convinced that a deep constitutional reform is required. Frankly speaking, we do not see any other ways for sustainable development of the Ukrainian state other than a federal state. Maybe some people know better and some magic formula can be found within a unitarian state. However, when the West, the East, and the South of this country celebrate different holidays, honor different heroes, have different economies, speak different languages, think differently, and are attracted by the culture of different European civilization, it is very hard to live in a unitary state in such condition. So what do we propose? First of all, there is an urgent need to stop the atrocity by armed gangs, to disarm illegal formations, to free illegally occupied buildings and all square streets, cities and villages. Maidan, and it's a dishonor for a European country, for one of the most beautiful European cities, to allow this happen over the last half year, to do this right in front of the eyes of Western visitors. There are answers that the Maidan will be here until the result of the presidential election supported by the Maidan. This is a dishonor for all those who tolerate this. Our proposition is to immediately start bringing all these affairs into order. All the more important is that this was the obligation signed by Klitschko, Yatsenyuk and Ternivok and German, French and Polish foreign ministers on the 21st of February, with a view to start constitutional reform, which would be comprehensive and include each and every political force and region with an equal voting right. They should start agreeing on a federation within the framework of which each region has broad authority in the area of economics, finance, culture, language, education, foreign economy and cultural ties with neighboring countries or regions, and where rights of all minorities are ensured. Taking into account the share of the indigenous Russian population, we propose and are convinced that there is no other way, all the more so that candidates to the president of Ukraine stated this many times, to make Russian the second official language, but inside each constituent entity of the federation to ensure rights of minority language according to the European Charter for regional or minority languages. The constitutional reform must be confirmed by referendum and reflect interests of all regions in agreement, and then after the adoption of this constitution by referendum to organize presidential and parliamentary elections, elect new legislatures or assemblies and regions and executive powers, governors, to make them elected rather than appointed. This is what the eastern and southern regions of Ukraine request. We are convinced that this is an absolutely correct way to achieve this. Some Ukrainian officials replied to us that Russian propositions are a provocation and interference into domestic affairs because we are proposing ideas which are incompatible with the foundation of the Ukrainian national identity. So what are these ideas? Federalization and secondly official language. I cannot understand why they are incompatible with the foundation of Ukrainian national identity. We are also convinced that the new constitution should undoubtedly formalize the out-of-bloc status of Ukraine. Now, on double standards and hypocrisy. We are now hearing all sorts of wild accusation against Russia, especially in the Western media. They say that Russia always chooses a game with zero result for itself to the hand offered by the West. A few days ago, a British newspaper published an article by Minister of Foreign Affairs of the United Kingdom, William Hague, who said that Russia is in isolation from everybody again, because when offered a hand, it turns its back and takes its own path on the basis of games with zero result. In Russian language we have a saying, we call it unfairly shifting to blame to someone else. It is hard to rebuke us of the aspiration to have fair joint partner work. This is included into our propositions about indivisibility of security, which should be equal for everybody rather than just NATO members. And we underline that this principle of indivisibility of security provides that there are no second-class peoples or countries, and therefore NATO should be used as a magnet to continue moving the dividing line further to the east. Actually, our Western partners promised that it will not be so, and they deceived us. They promised that NATO's military infrastructure will not move to our border. They deceived us. They promised that there will be no NATO military sites in the territory of its new members. They deceived us. At the beginning, we somehow perceived these promises with our ears, then we started to put them on paper as political obligation, under which serious people, Western leaders, signed. But when we started to ask why these political obligations are not implemented, and whether it was possible to make them legally binding, we heard this reply: it is impossible. Political obligations are sufficient, and you should not be distressed. All we do is not against you. If we speak about aims with zero result of each other's accusers, then the EU project, Eastern Partnership, from the very beginning was planned according to the, I quote, or logic, with us or against us. By the way, Western partners spoke about this from the elections in Ukraine in the year 2004, when there was no customs union or Eastern Partnership, but there was an artificially third tour of presidential election created, which was not envisaged by the Ukrainian constitution. At that time, the Belgian foreign minister and current EU Trade Commissioner Karl de Gucht requested from Ukrainians in public to make a free choice. Either they are with Europe or Russia. This is the origin of this kind of mentality. The Eastern Partnership just turned into an instrument of exploration of the geopolitical space, like the extension of NATO as well, when this project was pushed through by enemies completely ignoring legal economic interests not only of Ukrainian neighbors such as Russia and other countries, but also of the countries involved in it. There are many studies on this topic right now, and it was not made that Arseniy Yatsenyuk said that they need to see the economic side of this agreement, I mean the Eastern Partnership. The President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, in his speech of on the 18th of March in George Hall of Kremlin, stated very clearly that Russia is very worried about the positions of Russian-speaking nationals in eastern and southern regions of Ukraine, especially when different units of the right sector are headed there. The President of Russia requested from those in power in Ukraine and the Western sponsors to take urgent measures to stop this atrocity. He said that we will defend the rights of Russians and the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine using the entire arsenal of political, diplomatic, and legal methods. Nothing can be added to this. It must be fair work. We should not say, like in many other cases, be that Syria, Iran, or something else, that the crisis has happened and let us accept the given facts as reality. Now Russia must settle the Syrian crisis, resolve the Iranian problem, pacify the situation in Ukraine through direct negotiations with the Ukrainian authorities. The West consistently attempts to get rid of responsibility for the work with whom they have raised and supported for the achievement of their geopolitical goals. We have absolutely no intention or interest to cross the border with Ukraine. We only want to work collectively and to stop the atrocities which Western countries attempt to sweep under the carpet and present the situation in favorable tones and colors, and to make them become aware of their own responsibilities. As the acting Ukrainian Minister of the Interior, Arsen Avakov, stated, recent actions of Ukrainian leaders are aimed at disarmament of all those who illegally hold weapons. If these are results of work of our Western partners, then we're satisfied with these events. Together with them, we will be ready to search for joint recommendation for Ukrainians, which will be aimed at stopping any illegal activities and the start of a deep constitutional process to reform the state. Now, summing up. This new sharp turn in history was inevitable. The same people who were insisting on the legitimacy of Kosovo separation are now talking about Crimea being annexed. It is hard to find a more tangible example of practices of double standards, and I underline practices in the plural. And these practices are most evident in the countries that are often defined as new democracies. Heavily armed militants who destroyed the center of Kiev are represented as peaceful demonstrators, and 96% of Crimea population are painted as aggressive separatists. While nothing is new under this moon, a little bit earlier and in a different region, militants illegally trading in arms and human organs were painted as fighters for independence, and those who were chased away from their historical homeland as guilty of genocide. The result of this arbitrary treatment of reality is the crisis of regulatory role of international law and establishment of system of double standards that became a norm. It is evident that no matter who will win in the many presidential elections in Ukraine, there will be one loser. And that loser is the ideas and principles of the rule of law, because the legitimate mechanism of settling the crisis in Ukraine that existed in its beginning were discarded. And it is with great regret that we have to acknowledge that it is not an isolated episode in Ukraine. It is just one example of a global process of erosion of law as a regulator in interstate and domestic relations. Actions in Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, undertaken without UN mandate, are all testimonies of this trend on the global level. So what next? I think that no matter how deep today's crisis in relations between Russia and the West may seem, it will not last forever, because even the fiercest critics of Russia realize that without Russia's participation, many key issues of world politics could not be solved. For instance, Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, non-proliferation of nuclear weapon regime. But it's very doubtful that Russia will ever accept the role that West would like to give to us. The role of an attendant then can be summoned when necessary by a whistle blown by the master. It is clear to everybody that Russia cannot accept a unipolar world. Russia has not only expressed its will to protect compatriots that were humiliated in their public spirit, but to return back to the global arena as a subject that is aware of its strategic interests and is ready to protect them in a very consistent way. And of course, it is really interesting to read in many of the articles in Western mass media that this realization that Russia has its interests and is ready to protect them comes as a big surprise to many in the West. Well, this is a geopolitical reality that our Western partners need to take into account. Thank you for your attention.